Thank you all for being here. In 1995, my sister Marianne got married right here in this church. It was a big event for our family, but it had some added significance for me. At the time, I was dating Eileen, who eventually became my wife. And we had grown close, and I felt like it was time for her to meet my family. So I brought her to the wedding to meet the Cannons. At the time, Dad and I were not getting along. We were arguing, and there was some anger between us. Dad was tough. He had very high standards for himself and for me as his son. And when he felt I wasn't meeting them, he would tell me, and sometimes not so gently. And I would buck back at him, as young men do. Sometimes it was hard to be his son, and this was one of those times. And Eileen was aware of the situation, but still I told her, this weekend you might sense some tension between Dad and I. If you do, don't pay any attention to it. It's fine, it'll pass, it always does. But still, she didn't really know what to think about all that. I was in the wedding party, so I had responsibilities, and I had to separate from Eileen several times, and at one point during the reception, I had to leave Eileen alone, and after I was done, I went and found her, and I said, "Are you okay? Is everything going all right?" And she said, "Yeah." And she paused, and she looked at me, and she said, "What's the matter with you?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Why can't you get along with your father? He's the sweetest man I've ever met." And of course, she was right. Toward the end of his life, Dad had a lot of health problems, and Mom would look over him, and I'd like to take a moment here to stop and recognize my mother. Companions for 57 years. We would have lost Dad a lot earlier than we did if it weren't for her attention and care. We love you, Mom. One of Dad's recurrent problems was infection. And on one occasion in Florida, he had a dangerous infection, and we were all worried we might lose him. And I went down to Florida to see him and help out. And I spent several nights with him in the hospital. And he would sleep mostly, but when he woke up, he would be agitated and confused. And I would sit with him and try to keep him calm. And I encouraged him to talk about his life, the things he was proud of, the things that made him happy. And he talked about his family and Tiffany Street and St. Athanasius, about DiMaggio and Williams and Mantle, about the Navy, his years at Fordham. But on this one night, he told me a story I hadn't heard before. It was about a doctor and a student in a hospital, and I couldn't make sense of it. So the next day I asked my mother, "What was Dad talking about?" And she told me the story. When Dad was in his 50s, he needed an operation on his thyroid, and he had the surgery at Cornell Medical Center in the city. And he shared a room with another patient who was distraught. This man cried a lot. He wouldn't communicate. He wouldn't eat. And it turned out he was in the hospital to have his leg amputated. And he was in great distress over losing his leg. And Dad would talk to him and try to be good to him. And this man had many doctors coming to see him every day. One doctor in particular was a frequent visitor. And on the day Dad was discharged, this doctor came for his visit, and on the way out, he stopped at Dad's bed. He introduced himself as a doctor and a professor there at Cornell. And he said, "I want to thank you for your kindness to my father. My father tells me you've been talking to him, encouraging him. He told me that you're praying for him. And I want you to know I appreciate it." So Dad introduced himself back as a professor at Pace, and they got to talking about their work and in teaching, and their teaching. And Dad took a liking to this man, and he said, "I have pre-med students that I teach. They would really benefit from meeting you and talking to you. Would you come up if I invited you to see them?" And the doctor said, "No, I'm too busy. I don't have time for that. But here's what I will do." And he took out his card, And he said, in the future, if you have a student that you consider exceptional, encourage that student to apply here and then get in touch with me, and I'll make sure your student is accepted. And that's what happened. Dad had a student, a woman in her 30s, who had gone back to school to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. She applied, Dad reached out, and she got in and went to Cornell Medical College. Dad never told her about this. And as I said, I didn't know the story. As far as I know, he only told Mom. I've thought a lot about this story since I heard it. It's lingered in my mind. And not because Dad was kind to a man in pain, or that a man's son was grateful, or that Dad went out of his way or helped anonymously a student that he thought highly of. What I think about when I think about this conversation is, or when I think about this story, is the conversation between my dad and this doctor. It couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. This man didn't know Dad. He had no reason to help Dad, or any of his students, or any of his associates. Yes, he was grateful, but a thank you would have sufficed. And yet this man gave Dad a gift. I will see to it that one of your students is accepted here, based on your recommendation. The recommendation, essentially, of a stranger. How did this happen? Well, I know what I believe happened. Just as Eileen only needed a few minutes at Marianne's wedding to see Dad's basic sweetness, this doctor only needed a few minutes to see the other great qualities that made Dad who he was. He saw honesty, kindness, intelligence, selflessness. He saw a thoroughly decent and honorable man, a person he could trust with a gift like this, and who was worthy of it. He saw Dad being Dad, and Eileen was right. The sweetest man you've ever met, but so much more. Dad is a memory for us now. But for me, it's the qualities that this doctor saw that day during this short conversation that I value and treasure in his memory. And I hope all of you that knew him will remember him the same way. Rest in peace, Dad. You had a wonderful life. We love you. We miss you.